Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit publisher and cultural institution dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture for readers and writers to discover and rediscover. We're grateful to our partners for this evening's program: the American Historical Association, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, the Gilder Lehrman Institute, Massachusetts Historical Society, the National Archives, and the National Council on History Education. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our nonprofit mission. In 1861, as a bitterly fractured nation descended into the deepest crisis in its history, and American democracy seemed unlikely to survive, President-elect Abraham Lincoln boarded a train for Washington and his inauguration. An inauguration pro-slavery forces vowed to prevent by any means necessary. What qualities of leadership, what inner strengths allowed Lincoln to preserve the Republic and meet his rendezvous with greatness? What do the speeches he gave along the way tell us about how our most profoundly eloquent president struggled to find the vision and the words that could inspire the people and point the way forward? To answer these and other questions, we're incredibly lucky to have Ted Widmer, distinguished lecturer at Macaulay Honors College of the City University of New York, and author, most recently, of the riveting and beautifully written Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington. A former White House speechwriter and State Department advisor, Ted is editor of Library of America's 2-volume edition of Great American Speeches, volumes number 166 and 167 in the series. He's also edited a paperback selection for Library of America, American Speeches, Political Oratory from Patrick Henry to Barack Obama. Ted will talk for about 25 minutes, then invite your questions. You can submit a question or comment at any time using the Q&A button on your menu bar. Let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome Ted Widmer.
Max, thank you so much. So nice to be with you virtually and to be with all of our other friends. I'm really happy to talk about the book with this audience in particular because the Library of America has meant so much to me for so many years. It was in my head throughout the writing of this book for 9 pretty long years, but it was a part of my life going back decades. I remember when I was a grad student at Harvard in the 80s and 90s, 2 of my professors were very affected by the library. One of them, Dan Aaron, was part of the original team behind the Library of America. And you know that Dan and I were very good friends, and I brought Dan to an important celebration for the library a few years before he died. And another of my great professors was Alan Heimert, who was a subscriber and had every volume on a bookshelf behind him. And as I would come in to see him, it was always very intimidating. I'd have to face him with reports on my inadequate progress. And then behind him, month by month, the bookshelf was growing of books from the Library of America. And it was another reminder to me of how hard it was to be a grad student and how distant those goals were of immortality. But I read them deeply, I taught from them. I loved everything about the Library of America volumes, including, I must say, the feel of the books, the tactile feeling of holding a beautifully made product from the Library of America. And so I'm grateful to the library in any way I can ever repay it. I want to, and Max mentioned I edited a 2-volume set of American Speeches around 2006, and that was a thrill because by that point I deviated pretty far off course from my academic career and became a presidential speechwriter for a couple years. I wasn't a very important presidential speechwriter, but I did use that chance to really read deeply in the totality, I mean, as much as you can, of what presidents have written and spoken and said to the American people. And it's a very important form of discourse from the leader of our country to the people of our country about where things are going, State of the Union speeches, that kind of thing. And we took the best of that and made that 2-volume set. And it was really satisfying to do that, to try to put some order around a category that isn't always so orderly. We talk all the time. We're Americans. We like to talk. And so I really enjoyed working on that project. And I think even then I was probably thinking about a Lincoln project someday. One approaches the altar of Lincoln with a great deal of hesitation. There are so many books. It's been reported more than 15,000 books about Lincoln have been written. And yet it's so attractive to get closer to the writer of the greatest political writing we have ever known in our country. I think it's fair to say that. He is the best. I mean, it's a nice topic for an argument or a debate, but I think most of us would admit Lincoln's speeches set the standard for American political oratory, and maybe even for American literature, just for the pure distillation of meaning inside of short sentences about who we are as a people, our imperfections and our strivings, and how we can do better. I don't know if anyone has ever been more patient with our failures and more inspiring about helping us to get to the next level than Abraham Lincoln. And so I've been fascinated by him actually since childhood. And then during my own undergraduate and graduate learning, he was just too intimidating to really go near. But when I became a speechwriter, it was hard not to look at Lincoln's speeches because presidents like to quote Lincoln. They all quote him, including our current president, who doesn't quote presidents very often. And he doesn't exactly quote Lincoln, but he refers to him. He's sort of in the room with Donald Trump in a very interesting way, sometimes literally, as when Donald Trump went into the Lincoln Memorial to give a live interview with Fox, although I think that was maybe not satisfying to Donald Trump because Lincoln literally loomed up so large that it wasn't an equal contest. It was just another case of Lincoln looking huge and everyone else looking small. So I felt more drawn to Lincoln over the years, and I began to write little essays about individual speeches. I felt that I was a historian of speeches after the Library of America legitimized me as one. And in 2010 and 2011, the New York Times began to look at the Civil War as an important, I mean, to put it mildly, an important episode in American history. And we were beginning the 150th anniversary. And in the fall of 2010, it was the 150th of Lincoln's election and the beginning of the slow tearing away of the fabric that united the country as the southern states refused to be a part of whatever Lincoln's America would be. Even before they actually secede, they're already saying, no way, we will not be a part of this. It's over for us. And so I began to study that period very carefully from November 6th, 1860, when he's elected, to March 4th, 1861, when he is inaugurated. And most history books go through that like in 1 second. He's elected, he becomes president. And I found it was really anything but easy. It was probably the most serious threat to democracy in the history of the United States of America. And we very nearly lost it. And it remains miraculous to me that we didn't. And as I looked for reasons to explain why we held it together against all odds, I began to look really closely at Lincoln's train trip. It's only 13 days of his life. It's from February 11th to February 23rd, 1861. He goes on a train trip of a little over 1,900 miles, winding through a lot of cities of the Midwest and North before coming into Washington. And it's a remarkable odyssey. And I kept coming back to that word. In fact, I introduced quotes from Homer's Odyssey throughout the book. And like Homer's Odyssey, it's a journey of tremendous personal growth. It's not just that he's traveling a long distance, which he is, and fighting off monsters, which he is. There's a very elaborate Southern assassination plot brewing, most focused on the city of Baltimore, which is a Southern city, although it's to the north of Washington, D.C., but also perhaps focused on the steps of the Capitol itself, where he was to give his first inaugural address, a speech that's in at least 2 volumes of the Library of America, the Lincoln and the American Speeches. And so there were rumors of a plot to kill him as he's delivering his inaugural speech, and how he got to Washington and how he grew as a thinker and a speaker and a reader. He would have loved the Library of America. That became the story of my book. And I began with a few small essays in February 2011 in the New York Times Online. We were, a few other writers and myself, we were beginning to write what turned into a kind of lengthy project of writing about the Civil War called Disunion. And now there are 2 books called Disunion that came out of that series that I'm actually the editor of. And it was an incredible experience for me in every way. I got to see the ingenuity of all of these young historians using new kinds of sources, digital sources, and writing from the ground up, not always from the top down, although I generally was writing from Lincoln's perspective, so I was kind of at the top. But just, a tremendous diversity of historical talent writing about the Civil War and sending it into this series that the New York Times was putting online. And the informality of that kind of writing, a blog is more informal writing than a book, really helped me because I had been an academic writer, and I want to be the first to criticize myself. I was uptight. I was not relaxed. I was writing these careful statements I hoped no one would disagree with. I put in 20 footnotes with every tiny thought I expressed to back myself up with other people. And it was a kind of cowardly and boring kind of writing. And this faster journalistic writing in the pages of the New York Times, it wasn't even pages, it was just online, was really liberating. It helped me to speak more honestly, and Lincoln helped me to speak more honestly because I saw what he was up against, and I felt like if he could do it, all I have to do is describe what he's doing, and that's a lot easier than what he's facing. So I just began to follow him. And it was kind of unfashionable in academic circles. He's a very famous, dead white man who had a lot of power. And all of that is unfashionable. It was unfashionable when I started the project. It's even more unfashionable now. But somehow the power of the story was compelling. It just kept me going and got better and better and better. And the story of following Lincoln every few miles of his route on this journey of geographic progress through a big and geographically diverse country with mountains and plains and lakes and rivers. That was really interesting. And the story of Lincoln's growth as a speaker and as an internalizer of America's truths and a speaker back to America of what it needed to hear. That was probably the best story inside this book. So as he's traveling toward either his anointment as president or his death, which is about equally likely. He's growing at a very rapid rate as a reader and speaker, and speaking back to Americans these truths they really needed to hear. And he's doing what all readers of the Library of America love to do. He's going back to original sources. He's not asking handlers or interpreters to tell him what to think. He's saying, I need to go back to the well. I need to figure it out for myself. And so he's reading in the literature of the founders, and he has a particularly deep relationship with one document, which is the Declaration of Independence. And we have many founders. We have many founding documents. It can be a little bewildering to go into the founding, which, you know, people would like to say there's one message coming out of the founding of America. I don't think that's true. In fact, our revolution was a kind of a civil war of its own. It was a war that forced huge numbers of Americans who didn't agree with it to leave. They were called loyalists, and they went back to Canada or to England. They weren't from Canada or England. They were American, but they left because they weren't part of where America was going. And Lincoln was very focused on how different the founders were. His Cooper Union speech, great speech by Abraham Lincoln in late February of 1860 that helps get him the nomination, breaks down for audiences just how complicated the founders actually are. There's a certain number who signed the Declaration. There's a certain number who signed the Constitution. They're also working on the Bill of Rights. They're working on other documents like Jefferson and Madison's statute for the protection of religious freedom in Virginia, or John Adams' Constitution of Massachusetts, or the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. You know, they're all writing constantly, sometimes at odds with each other. And it's a kind of thicket of different meanings. And Lincoln went into that thicket and pulled out what he wanted. And in the Cooper Union speech, he pulled out that they actually didn't want slavery to survive. They were embarrassed about it at the time of the founding. They weren't strong enough to get rid of it, but they hoped that it would not continue into the long-term future of the United States. So he gave that speech. It made a sensation. He got the nomination. He was elected. He was elected with a very small plurality, not a majority at all. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, who most of us call the greatest president in American history, was elected with the second smallest percentage of the vote in American history. Interesting contradiction there. Our greatest president had our second weakest vote coming into office. Only John Quincy Adams had a smaller percentage in 1824, but Lincoln was elected with 39.8% of the vote in 1860, less than 40%. So how he turned that political weakness, it's the opposite of a mandate. It's just like a crack of a door opening, and how he turned that into becoming Abraham Lincoln and our country becoming the United States of America in the fullest sense of the word, the Union and the United States truly dedicated to the best ideas of the founders. I found a lot of that in these 13 days of Lincoln's journey. And a lot of it is in Lincoln's reading of the Declaration of Independence. So in this myriad of different documents by different founders, he kept coming back to the Declaration. And it, as everyone knows, it was written by a slaveholder. It was written by Thomas Jefferson, although it was actually written by a committee of 5 people. And Franklin was involved and John Adams was involved. Jefferson held the pen, but it was written by a committee. But Lincoln zeroed in on the immortal sentences of the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in those short sentences with short words, he found all he needed. It was enough to argue that this is a country based on enlarging the scope of human activity, of giving people a chance, of giving them rights to the extent that government can confirm their rights. And government was very weak in the 19th century. It's a lot stronger now. But also just encouraging people who were beaten down by systems in Europe that gave them no chance, or in this country, systems of racial oppression or religious discrimination or anti-immigrant feeling that were also denying people the chance to live life according to their fullest potential. And in a brilliantly artful way, Lincoln came back to those sentences over and over again and said, this is who we are as a people. And it can be held against him, and it has been held against him, that he didn't come out really specifically and say the most extreme abolitionist sentences that were being said. They were being said in 1860 and 1861. But he was playing for a larger game. He was trying to win the country over to believe in these truths. And he found, going through the Declaration of Independence, written by a slaveholder, the best way there was, the truest path to genuine equality that he could find. And he never deviated from it. So over the course of his 13 days, he kept coming back to the Declaration, and he literally goes into Independence Hall in Philadelphia and gives a beautiful speech about what the Declaration means to him, that is, in a way, the culmination of the journey. And I talk a lot about that speech. He's also just learned that there's a huge assassination plot against him that day, and it might be the last day he's ever alive. And he still says what he feels about the Declaration and says, I may be assassinated, and I don't care. This is what I think. And it's just a beautiful moment of personal courage and political courage and good reading, excellent reading of who we are as a people. We say things wrong, we get things wrong, we get violent, we get angry, but we have a beautiful, loving message at the core of our history that Lincoln kept coming back to and reminding us of. And he uses that beautiful phrase in his first inaugural, our better angels. And he basically is our better angel. He's inhabiting the role and saying we can do better. And in this train journey, he kept coming back to that and showing us how we could do better. So from his tiny, meager vote of 39.8%, how he becomes this very powerful president. He's really up there with Andrew Jackson in the 19th century as one of the two most powerful presidents of that time, and really elevates the office. In addition to the reputation of the United States, he elevates the office of the presidency. How he did that over these 13 days was fascinating for me to study, but basically he won over a lot of neutral people. He won them over with his phenomenal speech-giving ability. He can give about 10 different kinds of a speech. He can give a funny speech, a sad speech, a speech about how honored he is to be in a small town with the people he's around. Now and then, a sarcastic speech about the South and what it's trying to do. And so he picked up a lot of votes. It was a kind of campaign trip after he had already won. He had not campaigned as president, he stayed at home, but he was in effect campaigning on the road. And I also think he was absorbing a tremendous amount of information. It's a journey not only of reading, but of of actually traveling. He's on a train moving through the country. And one part of this story that hasn't been noticed too much, in my reviews, everyone has noticed Lincoln. He's front and center. But it's also a book about being on a train. I love railroads. I always have. And it's about seeing America out a train window in a way that is almost cinematic, like you're looking through glass like you do at a movie, and seeing the landscapes of America change and seeing the people looking at you for answers. And I think Lincoln underwent something very profound as he saw cities and rural districts and African Americans peering up at him in northern cities. And as he came further south, more and more African Americans who were not free to say what they thought. And I think seeing America was a pretty healthy preparation for becoming president of the United States. So after this intense writing experience in the New York Times Online, I just wanted to put it all into a book. And I thought, it's only 13 days. What'll it take me? 13 months? It'll be a year, 2 years. It took me 9 years, and I'm embarrassed about that. But in some ways, I'm happy because the book feels relevant. I was just writing a history book. I had no intention to comment on current politics. But our country is very divided now. And to look at how someone brilliantly wove it all back together is inspiring. It's inspiring and it's also instructive. It's instructive for politicians coming along who might look at how we can become a bigger country again and stop tearing each other apart. There were a lot of ways they were tearing each other apart in the fall and winter of 1860 and 61. I'm happy to talk about that. It was really bad and violent and hateful, just like it is today. I think it was even a little worse than it is today, but I think we are in the second worst crisis in our history. I think even in 1968 and 69 and 70, those were tough years. I think it's even worse now. So if we can look to Lincoln and his example of inclusivity, and he always looked at the South and said, you are our friends. You're not our enemies, you're our friends. We want to work with you to be a better country. And if we can get into that headspace, I'd be delighted. So I'm grateful to everyone who helped make this book possible. It sounds corny, but I'm grateful to Lincoln because I always felt I could depend on him. His shoulders are so strong and they've carried so many of us for so many years, and they carried me when I got a little lost. They carried me, and his strong sense of ethics and how to be a better person and a better country were really important to me. I'm grateful to my late editor, Alice Mayhew, who loved the Library of America, and she was the editor of Bob Woodward, who has this unbelievable new book that came out yesterday. She died right before the book. She died about 3 weeks before it was published. And I was really sad about that, but I feel like her spirit lives in the book. And I'm grateful to the readers across the country. And I really wanted it to be for people everywhere, just like it's a train trip across 1,900 miles, through many parts of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, but I wanted everyone to feel like they were a part of this journey. And I've got a lot of emails from just individual readers, and they mean a lot to me. I've never been able to give a book talk in person because the book came out April 7th, right after the pandemic hit. But these kinds of events are great. There's a silver lining on the cloud of the pandemic, which is that we can reach a lot of each other through Zoom lectures. So I'm grateful to all the people listening tonight. I'm grateful to Max and the Library of America, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Ted. That's really terrific. And I think actually you've addressed some of the questions I've seen coming in. Several people have asked about the State of the Union when Lincoln began his trip, and the Buchanan administration in particular. Randall Briggs of Tulsa, Oklahoma, asks, what did the outgoing Buchanan administration do during this crisis? And Jonathan Gelman from Pleasantville, New York, asked a similar question: how did Buchanan respond to the secession crisis? So I guess the question, it's part of a larger question, like what was the landscape that, in the Union when Lincoln began this trip, and how did that influence his decision to do this kind of whistle-stop tour?
Thank you. That's such a great question. I think the failure of James Buchanan is extremely interesting. And I wrote a piece in the Washington Post about 3 months ago about Buchanan, because we all sort of know he was a bad president, but we don't really know why. And I tried to explain it. And one reason is, even though he was from Pennsylvania, he was really deeply in the pocket of the South. He was a pro-slavery guy and would be scared to look at his shadow if a Southern politician didn't tell him it was okay. That's the kind of guy he was. And as the crisis is intensifying, so the country's heading toward the election on November 6th, and they begin to figure out Lincoln's going to win. And there's just massive breakdown in American democracy in every possible way. The Democratic Party, which has been the major party since Andrew Jackson, has split in two with a northern and southern wing. Northerners are used to disliking Stephen Douglas. He's a flawed person. He actually stood up to the Southern Democratic Party and formed his own Northern Democratic Party. It had flaws, but Stephen Douglas had some principles. I have a little bit of a soft spot for Stephen Douglas. And the split in the Democratic Party made it possible for Lincoln and the Republicans to win. Once they win, Washington sort of ceases to function. It's this weird thing to watch, but people just really hate each other. There are fist fights at parties in Washington. Southerners and Northerners can't stand each other. They still have to go to these receptions, but they hate it. There's more and more violence in the streets and even in Congress. And Buchanan, as president, might have been expected to shut it down. And I mean, I don't want to get too political now, but I just gave a Zoom talk last night about my deep respect for the Republican Party of my childhood, which was growing up in New England, where we had these interesting moderate Republicans who were the best politicians I knew of, like John Chafee in my state of Rhode Island, or Elliot Richardson in Massachusetts, and they were great. But anyway, Donald Trump in some ways resembles James Buchanan in late 1860, because Buchanan would literally go out one day and say something sort of pro-Northern to reassure the Northern part of the Democratic Party. The next day, he'd just say something wildly pro-Southern to placate the Southern part of the Democratic Party. And he was getting whipsawed around. He was just trying to please everybody, and he couldn't please anyone. And that division went right into his cabinet, where he had 3 extremely pro-Southern cabinet members who were so pro-Southern they were basically traitors. And that's a big word to use. Treason is a serious accusation, but I believe that they were. And they were John Floyd, the Secretary of War, so basically Secretary of Defense, who was frantically trying to ship arms from Northern arms depots into the South 6 months before the Civil War even starts. He's trying to send all the weapons from the North into the Southern states. Jacob Thompson, who's the Secretary of the Interior, who's crisscrossing the South saying, we're going to start our own country, and he's sending secret intelligence, I'm pretty sure, during sensitive cabinet meetings over like Fort Sumter in Charleston. He's sending all of the intel down to South Carolina. and Howell Cobb, who's Secretary of the Treasury, who's presiding over a complete economic failure of the United States in the final months of the Buchanan presidency. So all the money is going. They're trying to move all the weapons to the South. And whatever happens in a meeting with the president, they're telegraphing down to the people in South Carolina. So it's basically like the future Confederate government is already in the White House listening to everything. It's like a parasite occupying the body of the United States of America. And Lincoln has to come in and survive assassination and get physically into those buildings, which is not easy. He's got to stand on the east front of the Capitol and survive assassination. You know, the nature of a speech is you have to stand up in front of thousands of people. Anyone could have taken a shot at him. We know John Wilkes Booth was only a few feet away from him when he gave his second inaugural address. It's a paradox of our democracy. You have to go out in public and speak to the people, but the people can be so crazy that they want to kill you. So how do we fix that? So Lincoln has to then get into this building, the White House, which has been degraded by a pro-Southern president and his treasonous cabinet officers, and begin to rebuild the government of the United States of America. It's incredibly difficult. He makes mistakes. Lincoln is not perfect. He makes mistakes as he comes into office. He makes quite a few mistakes. But his heart was in the right place. And this is also a journey about ethically getting correct, figuring out what is right about who we are, and just charting a course for that destination.
You talked about the assassination attempt, and you talk in your book about the role that Dorothea Dix and Kate Warren played in getting Lincoln safely to the White House. Maybe you could just talk briefly about that. And also there's a question from Alan Rockman from Tulsa, Arizona, asking if harm had come to Lincoln, would Hannibal Hamlin have succeeded him? And in your view, with what effect? Historical effect, I think.
Those are great questions. And I'll try to give faster answers, Max, so we can get as many questions as possible. Sorry. You know, I'm a professor, among other things, so I start to talk and there's no stopwatch. I just keep going. Yeah, I was so happy to have women in this book. The Civil War is a fairly male world to look into, but women are, of course, there in all of the places, on the home front and sometimes near the battlefields. And these two women basically saved Lincoln's life. Dorothea Dix is a really interesting woman who is she did many things. If you look up her Wikipedia entry, it's a good read. Dorothea, A at the end, and Dix, D-I-X. And she's most well known for being a mental health advocate. And so she went all around the entire country, going to state capitals saying, you need to take care of your mentally handicapped people. And they were in all of the states. It's not a northern or a southern issue. There's a famous line about South Carolina, too small to be a country, too large to be an insane asylum. And it did feel like that a bit in 1860. So she's traveling through the South, including South Carolina, and she picks up intelligence from her friends. So she has friends who are Southern politicians, and she picks up intelligence that there was a major assassination plot against Lincoln. And she, on her own, she doesn't ask anyone for advice. It's a great lesson. She just goes to the person she thinks can make a difference. That's the head of a railroad line from Philadelphia to Washington. And she goes to the president of this railroad named Samuel Felton and says, you need to protect Lincoln. He's totally vulnerable. They're gonna kill him. So Felton hires a railroad detective named Alan Pinkerton, who later becomes famous. And he brings 8 detectives with him. One of them is a woman named Kate Warren, as Max said, who's incredible. She's a young widower who's a brilliant impersonator. This is all like a Mission Impossible movie. And she has a Southern accent. She goes around Baltimore and she in like a day or two, gets all the information she needs to know about the plot to kill Lincoln. And Pinkerton sends her personally to warn Lincoln on the train trip about all the people trying to kill him. So these two women probably saved Lincoln's life, and by saving Lincoln's life, probably saved the United States of America as we know it, as this big country that occupies so much of North America. And then the other question about Hannibal Hamlin is so interesting. If Lincoln had been killed, what would have happened? I mean, it was unclear. The founders had said, if a president is killed, the vice president will become president, but Lincoln is not even the president yet. He's only the president-elect. So it's conceivable Congress might have had an emergency session. They were already doing all kinds of stuff in these months. There were really weird things happening in Congress with some Southerners had left. Some Southerners had stayed with the intent of slowing down whatever the Northern government of the US would do against the US. They had left some moles, basically, to be there in the Senate. And then there was a peace conference with a former president, John Tyler, and other people trying to figure out a new way forward. So Washington is a mess. And if a president-elect had been assassinated, I think it probably would have been kicked into Congress, and Congress might have just picked its own candidate. Maybe it would have been Hannibal Hamlin. He was a senator from Maine, so he had friends in Congress, and he's a former Democrat, not a Republican. So he was kind of acceptable to a lot of people, but it could have just also been some more northern, like William Seward, who is a very powerful senator from New York, and he's the one Lincoln defeated to get the nomination. And it's hard to know what would have happened, but it would have been a disaster.
Thank you. So let's talk about the journey a little bit. We have a question from Mike McGeever of Villa Park, Illinois. What do you think Lincoln learned during these 13 days that changed his approach to the presidency? Now, you've talked about this a bit, and in your book, you described this fascinating process where the closer Lincoln gets to Independence Hall, something almost mystical seems to be happening, and he seems to be almost channeling the founders, communing with them in some way. And there's a certain kind of moral leadership or vision that and he even begins quoting the Psalms.
And the Bible, exactly.
Yeah, he quotes the Bible and referring to really the rededication of the temple, which is kind of how he begins, from your book, how he begins to understand what his mission is. So if you could just talk about that a bit. What's the change in his language as he moves through the journey? What does he learn that's going to be fateful for him, for the next 4 years? And what is this thing about channeling the founders?
It is like that. That's a good word to use, Max. And I know what a close reader of the Bible you are. You are a much closer reader of it than I am. And I may need your help in a second, because on the night before Lincoln goes into Independence Hall, he stands up and talks about being near to it. And it is as if he's close to Jerusalem. It's uncanny. And he says, if I ever speak a false word, may my tongue cleaveth. And what is the quote, Max? Can you remember?
Well, it's Psalm 137, where, if I forget thee, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its cunning and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. And he actually quotes that, but referring to Independence Hall and the vision of the founders in the Declaration, right? Isn't that what he's referring to there?
Exactly. I'm so glad. Thank you for remembering it better than I could. But may my right hand forget its cunning. It's just powerful language. It's beautifully written. And may my tongue cleave to the mouth of to the roof of my mouth. Is that it?
Yeah.
And we're not used to hearing presidents speak like that. And so something deep was going on inside of Abraham Lincoln the night before he goes into Independence Hall. And then he goes in, and then he doesn't speak in a biblical way there. He speaks in a very humble way. And he says, all of the political sentiments I have ever felt came from reading the Declaration of Independence. And I've thought about it since writing the book, and I think sentiment is an important word. It's not like a thought. It's not like a factual grasp of something. It's your feeling in your heart. It's what you feel as a human toward other people. And it's a kind of a religious feeling. And he felt that the Declaration was a blueprint for the best country we could be. We all know how we have failed in every generation to be that country. We don't have to go into the details, but he put back up there for people listening and watching what the highest goal was. And it was a goal that came out of the Bible and the moral teachings of the Bible, how a formerly oppressed people can be a happy people and treat each other better. And it came out of things that were not religious at all. The political precepts of the founding fathers, who were quite clear that religion didn't belong in all of what they were talking about. And Lincoln is pretty complicated on religion. He doesn't go to church very often. It's not a very good churchgoer, not very orthodox. He may have written a heretical document in his youth, poking fun at ordinary churchgoers and all the silly things that they believe. But there was no doubt that he had a deep spirituality within him that related to treating people well, recognizing the gleam of potential inside of all people, of all religions and races, and a powerful sense of his own destiny, of his own role in God's creation. He seemed to feel that very acutely, and he played a powerful role in that story. So it's just, some of the most interesting stuff that has ever happened in American history. And it is uncanny that as he is approaching our most sacred secular shrine, Independence Hall, which I argue was the true shrine. Washington is a fake shrine. Washington is this glittering city of half-finished white buildings, poisonous rivers. It's a kind of fake utopia. Independence Hall is the real thing. It's where we really figured out who we would be as a people. But as he's going into this secular shrine, he's actually feeling sacred thoughts from the Bible. It's just so amazingly interesting.
And you talk about the fact that there's a side of Lincoln which actually feels like he can commune with the dead in some way.
I believe that. Yeah, all these strange things happened to me in the writing of this book. I tried to be a rational person and an academic person, and something bigger and better took over. And I'm grateful to whatever it was. I don't think it was me. It was like Lincoln often said he felt like a higher power sort of took over. And I don't want to compare myself to him, but I often felt like I sort of stumbled into this larger story that I didn't even mean to stumble into. And it was fantastic. So as he was deepening, I felt like I was deepening also. And it really is it was a journey for me as a writer. And I hope it is a journey for the reader. And I talked a little bit at the beginning of the book about some works of literature that Lincoln loved as a young boy. One is Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Another is The Odyssey by Homer, or Don Quixote by Cervantes. And I really came to feel like this journey was one of those great odysseys of enlightenment, of an imperfect person getting to his destination, and in the process lifting up his people all around him. And in Homer's Odyssey, he has a lot of problems, but almost every time he stands up and gives a speech, he buys himself a little time, he creates a little room for himself to maneuver. And I felt like Lincoln was the same way. He's a clever man. He's not a helpless victim. He's a clever man. He's artful. And every time he stands up and gives a speech, he creates a little more room for himself. He finds more sympathetic people. He wins over maybe a few Southerners. He keeps the border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Virginia, in the Union in the nick of time. So when he gets there, they're still part of America. And somehow just the power of this journey really got me.
Several viewers kind of wanted to drill down a little bit into the slavery question and Lincoln's views, and I'll put that. So you talked a little bit already about how Lincoln kind of reconciled his view of the Declaration, and that that the Declaration was essentially anti-slavery, with his reverence for the founders who were slave holders, and several people asked about that. But they also said, did Lincoln's views on slavery change? And then that's Tom Brandt from Santa Ana, California asks that. Boris Shaw from Fayetteville, North Carolina says, I've never understood the South's reaction to Lincoln's election. He wasn't an abolitionist. Why couldn't they just wait 4 years? Like, what was the hurry? Mark Little of Jacksonville, Kevin Coughlin of Evanston, Illinois, and William Norton of Palm Desert, California, all asked about Andrew Johnson, which is to say, if Lincoln was so anti-slavery, why did he pick Andrew Johnson as his vice president, who would go on to unravel, much of what Lincoln had hoped he had accomplished?
Fantastic questions. I'll do my best. And also, Max, I want to just give my email. If people don't get their questions in, it's fine if they want to write me. It's Ted_Widmer, WIDMER, @brown.edu. I don't actually teach at Brown anymore, but I once did, and I kept the email. So I'll do my best to answer them personally if we don't get to them tonight. But it's true. Lincoln is squishy on slavery. There are a lot of different ways to look at him. There is one way that I find a little bit convenient, but not really getting to the bottom of the case. And that is, in today's pretty politically correct climate, to say he was not an abolitionist or even a racist. And there are things he said that are hard to hear, about how he would never want to be married to an African woman, or, little put downs here and there. I think he was playing a much larger game. He was going for the center of American opinion. He was trying to lead the whole country to get to a much better place. The country basically was racist. I love America, but it was a country that was not very evolved on race. Abolitionists were a tiny minority who irritated most of the rest of the country. Not to say they weren't right, but politically they were weak. And Lincoln is trying to become president and lead the entire country to somewhere better, and he lived up to that promise. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. That day, he became the greatest abolitionist in American history. And, I don't think anyone ever emancipated more people than Abraham Lincoln did. So I think he got there, but he is a good politician. That might make you dislike him, or it might make you like him. But he's working with a Congress that is not very abolitionist. He's a president working with Congress. All presidents have to work with Congress. Congress is not abolitionist at all. So he's got to get his stuff through piecemeal. And that's why he did the Emancipation Proclamation the way he did. It was a kind of a piecemeal document that he snuck in, but he did it brilliantly. And he kind of introduced it as a war measure and made it patriotic seeming, but almost invisibly turned the Civil War from a war against rebellion into a war for emancipation. And that was a huge change. And it also helped in Europe. It helped make it very hard for England or France to come in and support the other side who were fighting suddenly for slavery. They weren't fighting for their independence. They were fighting for slavery. And Lincoln rewrote the war that way. So I think he, in his slow, halting way, he did brilliantly. He kept the border states in the US, in the North, which he had to do. To lose Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland was devastating. I mean, you probably couldn't even be in Washington, D.C. if you lose Maryland. And he kept them in. It was an act of no small achievement, of no small statesmanship to keep Maryland in the United States of America. And then why does he pick Andrew Johnson? Great question. Andrew Johnson, unattractive in so many ways, not a very good vice president, not a very good president in most ways. But a lot of Lincoln's thinking was always about reconstituting America. That, you know, there's a fiction that he never deviated from. So this huge war is happening. Half the country is left. They don't want to be any part of America. Lincoln insists on this idea, kind of whimsical almost, that the United States is pure. It has never changed. These people are just temporary rebels. They will be brought back in the fullness of time. The United States is going on like it always has, and he never deviated from that. So bringing in Andrew Johnson was bringing in a Southerner to make it look good to other Southerners that they would be welcome in the new United States of the second term. And Johnson's an interesting guy. He's a kind of Jacksonian Democrat. He's, you know, from the bootstraps, a poor kid who made good. He's also, he did some good things early in his career. As the South is seceding in the fall of 1860, he gave a very brave speech, the only one given by a Southerner, saying, I completely disapprove. I'm with the United States of America. I hate secession. He was the only Southerner who said that at that time. So there were impressive things about Andrew Johnson, but of course, you know, it was too much for him. He wasn't a good vice president or president, and he was impeached, not convicted, but you know, that was a dark period in the history of the presidency. So good question, but there were reasons that he appealed to Lincoln.
Okay, we're coming toward the end. I think maybe one last group of questions, which all have to do, interestingly, with the train.
Oh, I love it, because no one ever asked me about that, and I love the train.
So let's talk about technology for a second. I mean, in 1861, both the train and the telegraph were new technologies, kind of like the internet now. So there's kind of a bunch of questions around that. You know, Richard Nahn of Los Angeles says, did Lincoln sleep on the train or stay in local accommodations? It's a very straightforward question. Other people asked, Patsy Baudouin says, what about the people he meets on the trip? What impact did they have? Scott Smith says, did Lincoln meet any interesting fellow passengers? Other people ask about was there a particular whistle stop or two that especially struck you? So I guess, you know, questions both specific, like what was a train trip like? How did the physicality of it, you know, kind of affect Lincoln? And but also, you know, tell us some stories about people he met or places he went. And, you know, as part of the research for your book.
I'm so happy to have that question, and I'm so sorry we're out of time, and it's my own fault for giving long answers, but I'm serious. The train is like the other hero of the book besides Lincoln. And every review and almost every Zoom call I've been on has focused on Lincoln. How can you not? He takes up all the oxygen, but the train is the other star. It's the supporting, gets the Oscar for best supporting actor in this story. And trains were enormous. So I wrote this chapter 3 of the book, and my editor kept beating me up over it. It was so long and so boring, and it took years for me to make it a normal chapter, but I have hundreds of pages of railroad research. If you want to email me, maybe I'll even share some of it with you. But I I basically found that trains are a huge story. They're changing America, like the internet has changed America since it came out in the 90s. And they're rewiring, telegraph wires go along train tracks, and they're pulling immigrant families into the upper Midwest, and they're helping huge new companies become very wealthy as they can send their products all over the country. It's just revolutionizing this country. And Lincoln was aware of that. And Lincoln is an attorney for the railroad and understands in a visceral way what trains mean to people. And he likes trains. He rides on them all the time. He rides on them so often. He has a special little piece of white paper you could put in your hat that meant you were a deadhead. It meant you rode for free. And he's just riding on trains all the time, sleeping on them, having meetings on trains. In Illinois, they're a huge fact of life. So the train trip was not incidental to this book. It was like a crucial part of the experience of writing it and I hope reading it. And so he's basically giving the first whistle-stop tour of a president. And before the trip started, he wrote out one speech per day. He's so organized. He knew he'd have to give one big speech every day, and he wrote it out ahead of time. But then as the train starts to go, he realizes he has to give about 40 speeches a day. He has to speak every 5 minutes as the train pulls into a tiny town. The entire population of a town, plus the same amount of people again, would show up because they were so worried about where America was going. So he just has to go out there with no speech. And that is not easy for a politician. And he handles it brilliantly. And he dips into his very deep reservoir of jokes and stories. And one of my favorite stories of a trackside moment, he's beginning to tell a joke. And the joke is about an undertaker who's got a very slow horse. And he's not sure the horse is going to make it in time. And as Lincoln is telling the story, the train starts to pull away from the crowd and they start running after him, and he starts speeding up the joke to try to get to the end. And he can't get to the end. So there are all these fantastic human moments of people in small towns, big cities, just coming to hear Lincoln. In another town, Xenia, Ohio, they'd set out a beautiful buffet lunch for the Lincoln party and his entourage. But they let the crowd come into the hotel where it was all set up, and they devoured it like termites. So when Lincoln's crowd came in, all that was left were a few shards of bread, and he had to give a speech starving and get back on the train, and no food. And so it was chaotic. But the train was also very strong and kept carrying him through all of these threats to his life. And I think he found a kind of comfort being on the train with his family in a situation that kind of resembles Air Force One. And these trains were very fancy. It's funny, he's the log cabin candidate, and he's sitting in unbelievable splendor with sofas and fabrics draped over windows and stoves heating the presidential compartment. And he's pretty comfortable on this train. Did he sleep on the train? Only the last night. And every stop he came into a hotel and went to bed. But the last night is incredibly dramatic. He takes a secret train. He takes a tiny train with one car from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, where they secretly put him about 10 seconds before the last train from Philadelphia is leaving for Washington. Lincoln's carriage pulls up, and they let him into the back of the train, and he goes into a special compartment, although it is only an ordinary passenger compartment. And he rode all night from Philadelphia through Baltimore to Washington. And we have a lot of great information about that night from Kate Warren, the the female spy who was with him, who said she looked down at him once and his body was he was so tall that he had to scrunch himself up to get onto the berth of the train. And it's just such an amazing image of this man who's going to save our country, who's going to rewrite who we are as a people with his words and his actions as commander-in-chief. You know, he prosecutes a very forceful war, but also his words about forgiveness and impeachment and being the best country we can be. And she's in the upper berth looking down and he's just scrunched up like anybody. And it's a beautiful visual detail. And I tried to get those into the book.
Thanks, Ted. I think we have to leave it there, but that's like the perfect place to end. And I urge you all to read the book. That last movement of the train coming from Harrisburg through Philadelphia to Washington is like a page-turning, riveting read. So as I say, I urge you all to read it. Thanks, Ted, very much, really.
Thanks, Max. Love the Library of America.
You've been listening to Ted Widmer on Abraham Lincoln, whose writings and speeches are collected in 2 volumes in the Library of America series, edited by the late Don Fehrenbacher, as well as in 2 volumes of Great American Speeches, edited by Ted. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. Next Thursday, September 17, we launch Lift Every Voice, a nationwide celebration of 250 years of African-American poetry with a special 2-hour program in partnership with the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, featuring Kevin Young, Sonia Sanchez, Elizabeth Alexander, Jericho Brown, and performances by Mahershala Ali, Felicia Rashad, and saxophonist Kamasi Washington, among others. Then on Wednesday, September 23rd, Princeton University's Eddie Glaude Jr., New York Times bestselling author of Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, joins LOA Live for the next episode of Reading James Baldwin Now. Details about these and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's Abraham Lincoln and American Speeches editions and links to purchase those and other volumes of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Ted Widmer, and have a terrific evening.